Hello, and welcome to the DC Bar's Brief Encounters podcast. My name is Parveen Huda. I'm co-chair of the Human Rights and Immigration Subcommittee of the DC Bar's International Law Community. I will be speaking solely in this capacity. Today's podcast, which is being recorded on Tuesday, March 10th, 2026, is spotlighting recent developments in India's citizenship laws that have galvanized politicians, religious and secular community organizers, lawyers, journalists, and human rights activists. In December 2019, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, or the CAA. The CAA sparked nationwide protests, some violent and deadly. Due in part to this unrest, the government delayed the law's implementation until March 2024. As the program will explore, by expressly conditioning citizenship on religious affiliation, the CAA threatens the country's long-standing commitment to secularism and equality under the Constitution. To date, there are more than 200 constitutional challenges to the law pending before India's Supreme Court. The CAA, in its implementation, also magnifies existing tensions between religious communities through rendering certain individuals, primarily Muslims, legal and societal outsiders, or, to quote the law's architects, infiltrators. India's population is approximately 1.4 billion, of which 80% are Hindu. Muslims number 200 million, comprising approximately 15% of the total population. The remaining 5% are a mix of primarily Jain, Parsi, Sikh, Christian, and Buddhist. With that, I want to turn to our guests. Joining us to discuss these issues are Ashish Yadav, a legal scholar, and Ankita Kumar, a journalist and documentary filmmaker. Ashish is currently pursuing a doctoral degree in Australia at the Melbourne Law School's Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness, focusing on nationality in the context of displacement caused by climate change disasters. He previously served as the assistant professor and assistant director of the Center for Public Interest Law at the Jindal Global Law School in India, where he led India's first clinic on statelessness. Ankita Kumar is an award-winning Indian origin journalist and documentary filmmaker based here in the US. She has won numerous awards for her reporting, including a San Francisco Press Club Award and the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents Professional Excellence Award. Today, we will be speaking with Ankita about her first film, Far From Home, a short documentary about Afghan refugees in India. The film has been featured in several festivals, including the American Documentary and Animation Film Festival. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Parveen. Really looking forward to this podcast.
Great. So Ashish, I'm going to start with you and draw on your scholarly expertise. And then we'll turn and talk with Ankita a little bit about the film. And I think what you're going to be talking to us will provide a good background to think about some issues that her film explores in a very compelling and firsthand way through looking at a family caught up in the unjust immigration and citizenship laws in India. But first, I want to situate the CAA in its broader legal context and then explore the key changes that it made to Indian citizenship rules. The Citizenship Act of 1955 is the underlying law that the CAA amended. And my understanding is that in 2003, pursuant to certain changes, the government introduced the category of quote unquote illegal migrant. And so my first question, Ashish, is who is captured under the category of illegal migrant?
Yeah, so the illegal migrant category includes anyone who enters India without a valid passport and a valid visa, and also persons who enter India with those valid documents, but then overstay their visa.
That's helpful. And just to be clear, there's no reference to any other descriptive categories or status, for example, religion, caste, ethnicity, or in fact, a date of arrival, correct? At least at that time.
Absolutely
in
not.
2003. Okay, thank you. So there are two categories, as you noted, as to how you could fall within that category. And those so-called illegal migrants could not obtain citizenship. Now, what about their children? Suppose their children are born in India.
Their children would also not be able to acquire citizenship because they would certainly be born with one parent who is the illegal migrant, thereby closing the route to citizenship by birth. And since they're born in India, they cannot acquire citizenship by descent. And then comes the two other routes to acquire Indian citizenship, namely by registration and by naturalization. But none of the categories in the citizenship by registration under Section 5 of the Act help such persons who are born to a parent who's an illegal migrant. And as we'll see with naturalization shortly, when we discuss the CA, we will notice that they do not have legal residence as illegal migrants themselves, and similarly, their children do not have legal residence in India, and thereby they cannot acquire citizenship either.
So what we're talking about, the consequence, even back, well before the CAA, which, as I noted, was implemented just 2 years ago, more than 20 years prior to that, the consequence of the 2003 amendments was that millions of individuals would not ever be able to naturalize. And that would be the case even if they're born and raised in India.
Yeah. I think it's good to sort of put this in a broader context. When India became independent, it was partitioned by the British administration into India and Pakistan and led to massive forced displacement across the border. Around 14 million people were displaced across India and Pakistan, and there was East and West Pakistan. So, on both sides of the border, there was this massive displacement. At the same time, then the Indian Constitution did not codify citizenship law of the country. It just said that anyone who entered until a certain date around the partition would be an Indian citizen, and anyone who was in India at the time the Constitution was enacted would also be Indian. But then it left the power to regulate citizenship to the parliament. And that's where the 1955 Act comes in. Now, the 55 Act had a jus soli foundation, birthright citizenship, like in the US. But over time, it's been chipped away. And in 1986, it was diluted to a jus sanguinis rule, the law of the blood, where being born in India was not enough. People had to demonstrate that at least one parent was also an Indian citizen. And then eventually the 2003 amendment comes in where the category of illegal migrant is introduced, further denying citizenship to any person born in India. And the 2003 amendment then requires that a person must be born in India, one parent must be an Indian, and the other parent must not be an illegal migrant. And so this is a cycle of denial of citizenship, further restricting it to categories of persons as compared to when we go back to the Jus Soli Foundation. And that the 2003 amendment is the operable law in India now, vis-a-vis citizenship by birth.
Thank you. And just for our audience, if you could explain what jus soli is.
Yeah, jus soli is birthright citizenship, so the law of the soil, which means the kind of citizenship law you have in the US, where anyone born in the country acquires citizenship only by the virtue of being born in the country. The resident status, the immigration status of the parents does not matter. And that is the law that India used to have from 1950 till 1987.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then as you notice, then it moved to this jus sanguinis, or the blood familial citizenship model. I wanted to also ask you, you're talking about these different categories that are dividing and then leading to these massive groups that can never naturalize. Related to that is the fact that there's also simply a documentation or paperwork hurdle that applies across groups, right? Even to individuals who may not be related to or born to one or more quote unquote illegal migrants. So, how does an individual demonstrate that he or she is a citizen?
Yeah, that's a very contentious question in India right now, given the throes of the citizenship determination exercises that we find ourselves in. But this goes back to a fundamental issue that there's no one single document that can prove citizenship in India. The documents that people commonly perceive demonstrate citizenship actually do not, such as the Aadhaar card, which is our national ID card system, which provides access to government subsidies. Even if you need to buy a SIM card, you need to have an Aadhaar card, and for all sorts of government business interaction with the state, you require that. And there are other documents that are in citizenship determination exercises people routinely present, and their veracity or their reliance upon them has been questioned by the courts. So far, I would say perhaps the passport is the only document that has not been outrightly questioned by the courts in instances where it's been presented by persons as proof of their nationality or Indian citizenship. So, yeah, it's difficult to say how an individual would demonstrate their citizenship. The rules keep changing because, again, going back to the issue that there is no singular citizenship document which is beyond question.
And if you had something like a work card, for example, that too might not be sufficient. Like an employer gives you a card, for example, perhaps that might allow you to work, but that wouldn't be proof of anything further.
Yeah, absolutely. In the kind of citizenship exercises that we see, the broader ones that are happening lately in India, where the electoral rolls are being revised, that effectively also becomes a citizenship determination exercise. And there we see that the goalposts are also shifting again and again about what counts as a proof of citizenship. So we do understand that a bunch of documents need to be provided, and no document by itself proves citizenship. And depending on the context and the communities that the government is addressing under the citizenship determination exercises, there we see that they have demands from the community about a certain set of documents. Again, it must be said that it depends on how the government has drafted the citizenship determination exercise. There are various kinds that have gone forward in India lately. And the current kind that we see is done through the Electoral Commission of India. There is no single document that proves citizenship in India, and that is a fundamental problem.
Thank you very much for that. And I think the bottom line is that it's been contentious dating back decades. And now I want to shift and talk a little bit about how the 2019 CAA further complicates and further divides communities. The 2019 CAA amended the India Citizenship Act in a dramatic and unprecedented way. Now, the government characterizes the law as a quote unquote humanitarian response to the plight of religious minorities in three countries: Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, India's three Muslim majority neighboring countries. Sort of a high level summary is that it provides what's referred to as an expedited citizenship track offered to certain individuals who would otherwise remain, quote unquote, illegal migrants, most likely in perpetuity, as we've discussed. Can you talk a little bit about who is eligible for expedited citizenship and what criteria must be met?
Yeah, absolutely. So, under the CAA, six religious communities from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, that is, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, Christians, and Parsis, would be eligible for the expedited citizenship track, which is that the nationalization requirement for these communities, if they entered India now, the new date is before the end of 2024, they only need to demonstrate 5 years of residence in India, as opposed to everyone else who still has to demonstrate 11 years of residence in India before filing the application for naturalization. Given the criteria that Praveen asked about, these communities would need to demonstrate three things. First, that they entered India before the cutoff date. Second, that they have been indeed citizens of one of the three countries that are listed here: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And third, they are members of that religious community that they claim to have come from.
It seems like there's a profound gap between the government's stated objective and the actual impact of the law. As critics have noted, the category formation and the distinctions that are drawn seem arbitrary and selective, treating certain groups more favorably solely on the basis of religion. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about the stark exclusions, both of any other religious groups in the three countries or of groups fleeing religious persecution in other countries, neighboring or elsewhere. So, for example, what kind of rights would members of other religious groups have, ones that aren't in the specified six groups from those three countries? Suppose a Muslim migrant from Afghanistan.
Yeah, so Muslim migrant from Afghanistan, if they entered India at the same time as any of these six communities did, have the same nature of documents, have the same set of documents, they would not be able to naturalize in India in all likelihood. Because, especially considering Muslim migrants from Afghanistan, the common route that they used to take before the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan in August of 2021 was that they were provided visas to study or to seek medical treatment in India or to visit family. And then they would often apply for asylum to the UNHCR under the duration of their visa provided by the Indian government. Very often, the UNHCR process would take too long and the visa would expire, which meant that for the Indian immigration regime, they become an illegal migrant. And as we spoke about it before, illegal migrants are prohibited from acquiring Indian citizenship.
So they're essentially caught by the nature of the way they come and then really just delays and procedural challenges that are out of their control. So then what that also means is that the 11 years doesn't really mean anything in that context, right? Even if they're residing for 11 years, they wouldn't be able to naturalize. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the catch indeed. And that was happening even before the CAA came around, because all that the CAA does is to create an exception for the non Muslim migrants from the three countries. Muslim migrants are still in the same position that they were after the 2003 amendment. What that means is that if a Muslim migrant from Afghanistan today, who's been in India, let's say for a full 2 decades, let's say they came in 2005, 2006, and have been residing in India and are recognized by UNHCR as refugees, and then thereby they have a card issued by UNHCR that provides them very basic access to some essential services in India, but not residency rights. What do they need to do to acquire residency rights? They need to apply for something called the long-term visa with the Indian immigration authorities that would then allow them to reside in India legally. Now, what happens when such a person, a Muslim migrant from Afghanistan, would seek to apply for Indian citizenship by naturalization? They would be asked to demonstrate legal residence in India. Unless they have the long term visa, they would not be able to do so. Now, the long term visa was indeed available on paper for some time, but 2016-17 onwards, through a series of amendments in the surrounding delegated legislation to the Citizenship Act, the government has restricted the long term visa also to non Muslim migrants from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. So effectively, that route is shut. They cannot regularize their stay in India through acquiring the long term visa, the residence permit.
I think this is interesting. And as we'll get to in our discussion with Ankita, what her film brings to life and conveys is that an Afghan Muslim residing for several years in India, as you said, even if long term, can't get that long term visa. And so they're essentially shut out of any kind of meaningful labor market opportunities, right? They can't be part of the formal economy. I also just wanted to briefly touch on some other exclusions. Part of what the message seems to be is that there's no recognition in the government that Muslim minorities actually exist, that is, and that they could be fleeing religious persecution. Could you just cite a few examples of those groups that there's complete silence regarding them in the law itself?
Yeah, I would say it's a glaring omission and which betrays the real intention of this law. So there are religious groups such as Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan who are persecuted as a community. Then there are Rohingya refugees in Myanmar, the country that's not even included in the CA. Then there are various religious groups in Sri Lanka, Tamil Hindus, for instance, were not included. But at the same time, there could be Muslim minorities such as the queer Muslim, such as Muslim women who are facing persecution, such as political persecution faced by a Muslim person in any of these countries, which is not included in the CA. So it has a very singular vision of persecution in these countries, and that is religion based, which means that obviously the government has a certain view of what kind of persecution is happening in these countries. And then they look at India as the religious homeland for the Hindus and other religions that are facing persecution in countries where they are categorizing them as Muslim majority countries, done by, have an Islamic bent. And that was one of the things that the government cited when they introduced the law, that these countries have constitutions rooted in or legal regimes rooted in Islamic law.
I want to pick on one point you make, which is relevant for our discussion of Far From Home, which is that in the context of the Taliban, what is being litigated in international tribunals is this category of gender persecution. So there are these other forms of discrimination or persecution that also may actually intersect with this one category of religious persecution, and that many categories are left out. Another issue is that it's totally silent on many countries. For example, again, the Uyghurs in China are completely left out, even though, like with these other groups you mentioned, the Rohingya, Ahmadiyya, that there are documented religious persecution cases well publicized by UN observers and NGOs. At the time that the CAA was first introduced, the Indian government was thinking about a national registry of citizens. And it sounds like in the intervening years, the government has abandoned this registry. However, I wanted to get your thoughts on the objectives in thinking about a registry. And I'm aware that the state of Assam, which you have studied in detail, had such a registry. And perhaps you could talk just a little bit about that model.
Yeah, at the time when the CA came about, the government, especially through the Union Home Minister, openly spoke about how the CA should be seen in conjunction with a national registry of Indian citizens, where every Indian citizen would be listed and citizenship would effectively be verified. And at that point, there was a lot of discussion about whether that would look like the Assam registry. Assam registry was a separate legal process run by the Supreme Court of India, and sort of which goes back to an agreement that some political parties in Assam had made with the central government some decades ago. But the Assam registry effectively meant that all the residents of that province, around 33 million people, had to demonstrate citizenship from 2014 until 2019. Was a long drawn exercise, at the end of which 1.9 million people have been left outside the register. Their status is unclear at the moment, and the full legal process vis-a-vis determination of their citizenship has not been completed yet. But what was said in 2019 about making this kind of a registry nationwide has not yet happened. The idea was that there would be some kind of determination of citizenship throughout the country. And if there are any non Muslim migrants who fall outside of it, then the CAA would be a law that they could rely on to protect themselves. Again, sort of going back to the idea that non Muslim communities, and especially Hindus, are the people who deserve to be in India, and India is the homeland of Hindus. So they would want to protect them from citizenship denial or deprivation. Any such communities would fall outside the scope of this intersection of the National Register and the CA.
In lieu of a national registry, it sounds like the next venue or opportunity to do some sort of assessment would be the census. And I believe there's one planned for 2028. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the growing concern right now, that the census would probably do what performs the similar objectives that the National Register of Indian Citizens would have. And maybe by the end of this year, we would have the census rules ready, which would then shed some light on whether it is performing that same exercise. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to just briefly touch on two more points. One is the constitutional challenges. There are more than 200 challenges pending. There was one full suit filed by the Indian Union Muslim League a day after the law was passed. That was 2019. And here we are several months into 2026. No substantive ruling thus far. Is there a realistic chance that the Supreme Court would rule anytime soon? And it sounds to me like there's several bases for challenges, including Article 14. Could you just talk briefly about that article?
Yeah, absolutely. So the constitutional basis of the challenge is rooted in the right to equality, that is in the Article 14 of the Indian Constitution, that demands that there cannot be distinctive treatment on the basis of a protected ground such as religion. And so it forms the basis, among many other constitutional provisions, to challenge this law. The court is finally going to hear this starting May this year. I'm not too optimistic about what the court might hold, but it remains to be seen how the discussions go.
Okay, great. And then my last question, I just wanted to zoom out. We've been talking about domestic law, but there are clear fundamental international law considerations at play here. The UN and human rights oriented NGOs have denounced the CAA from an international law perspective. Could you touch briefly on the application of international refugee law, if at all?
Yeah, so India is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which means that UNHCR in India operates at the pleasure of the Indian government. And India has had a very piecemeal humanitarian response to various refugee crises in the neighborhood. India is a big refugee host country. There have been communities living here for decades, but policy is up to the Indian government. And they routinely, and especially lately, do not provide all the legal protections that refugees anywhere should have, such as the UNHCR refugee card, as we were speaking about before, does not constitute as a legal proof of residence in India vis-a-vis the Indian citizenship regime.
Thank you, Ashish, for that really helpful and very thoughtful look at the legal context and the history of the CAA. This is a great chance for me to apply some of these thoughts as they're dramatized so beautifully and so movingly by Ankita in her film. So, Ankita, I'm going to turn to you now. And first of all, congratulations on the film.
Thank you so much.
You and I met 2 years ago during Far From Home screening in Seattle at Tasvir, which has an annual South Asian Film Festival. And more recently, I attended a screening sponsored by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, a funder of your film, at the National Press Club here in DC. So, my first question is, what are your plans for distributing the documentary to a wider audience, both here and abroad?
Yeah, thanks for starting off with that question. It's an important one for me, definitely. So, right now, the goal is we are looking at a wider worldwide distribution rather than a concentrated distribution in just one country. I would have loved to release theatrical release in India this year, but given the current political situation around the world, I don't think I'll be able to travel. And Nasiruddin Shah joined the film as executive producer last year, so ideally I want him to be there at one of the screenings as well. So there's a lot of planning that needs to go in there. We are also debating whether we want to have an India cut of the film. But apart from that, definitely we're looking for a worldwide distributor and OTT platform that does take up short documentaries. And if that can be released in India as it is, that would be the ideal route for us.
Would the India cut mean some revised version due to political concerns about its reception by the government?
Yeah, partly. The team members are a little concerned about what might happen to them after the film is released. In fact, the cinematographer of my film chose to go with an alias in the credits. It's not his actual name because he was just very scared of the repercussions for him as a Muslim man in India.
Well, I really hope it does have a wide audience. And it's so timely and important to be spotlighting these issues here. And they resonate certainly here in the United States as well as in India and other countries where there are individuals fleeing persecution on various grounds. So thank you again for making it. I wanted to talk a little bit about your objectives in making this film. In an article that you wrote last year, you described this film as, quote, shedding light on the unseen lives of Afghan refugees in India. You also noted that in many respects, the world has moved on since August 2021, the date that the US left Afghanistan and the Taliban returned to power. Specifically, you remarked that, quote, the less we talk about Afghanistan, the more we doom the Afghans to their fate. Could you elaborate on those thoughts in connection with making this film?
Absolutely. So, my biggest concern when I started this film was how long will people discuss Afghanistan? Because when I pitched the film to the Pulitzer Center, Afghanistan was a fresh topic. I had pitched the story around end of 2021. We had a grant when I was studying at Northwestern University in Chicago. The university had a partnership with the Pulitzer Center in which certain fellows were selected from the university. And at that time, I had pitched the story, and Afghanistan had just fallen to the Taliban in August 2021. I think we all remember the horrific images of the planes taking off and the Western world practically abandoning Afghanis to their fate. So I did have this concern that how long will this continue to be an important topic for those in the West? Because at that time, the idea was to make a film that also covers a lot of what the Taliban has done in terms of abusing women. That couldn't happen because the original subject of the film refused to shoot with us at the last minute. So then we had to change tracks and look at another angle. That's how the CA angle became so important for us later. And at that time, when we were doing the film, it was very, very important. And I think this particular year, and even last year, the film has become more important because minorities and refugees are in general at such high risk of persecution. And unfortunately, the topic of Afghanistan again came up last year in November, right before my screening at the press club, which was a very, very unfortunate incident of an Afghan national shooting two National Guard officers. And it obviously led to a lot of ramifications for the Afghans in the US. A lot of them are asylum seekers, they're on parole, and they continue to be taken away. And it's just a very unfortunate situation. So, Afghanistan, I feel now comes up in the news only when something big happens. Otherwise, it's not something that's on everyone's mind.
Thank you. That's, I think, very apt. description of how, unfortunately, Afghans are portrayed in the media. But then there are these moments that remind us how critical it is for us to be supporting refugees and also how vulnerable these populations are in South Asia and the Middle East, but also in other countries right now. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the subject of the film. You mentioned Samira Faizi, the lead figure. And for our listeners who have not yet seen the film, but hopefully we'll have a chance to do so. As you noted, you're pitching the film 2021, and then your film starts and covers 2022, a period after Samira's arrival. She arrives in India, settles in New Delhi along with her husband and two sons. Can you talk about the timing of her arrival, why she chooses India, and what her relationship is with India? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in Samira's context, and in the context of a lot of Afghan refugees, actually, I don't have the specific numbers on this, but a lot of Afghans typically come to India for medical help. In fact, Hamid Karzai, the former president of Afghanistan, had two of his children in India after his wife was advised to seek better medical health care in India. In fact, a lot of Afghans used to get employment in Delhi's hospitals as translators of Dari, which is the language commonly spoken in Afghanistan. So we have a history of Afghans coming to India. Samira was one of them. She was diagnosed with a rare neurological disorder. It was a couple of years before the situation got really bad in Afghanistan. And she used to come to India almost every year. And in fact, her family is very interesting because her mother and two brothers, they immigrated in the early 2000s because there was a lot of violence going on at that time as well. And that is when their family decided, we can't stay here anymore. We need to go to a safer country. So they chose to come to India and sort of accepted their fate that we are going to be illegal migrants here for the rest of our lives. So in 2021 March, Samira and her husband, they decided that this is the right time to move out because the situation was getting pretty bad in Afghanistan. The Taliban had already started taking over several cities and they were heading towards Kabul. So this is a couple of months before Kabul officially fell. So because the violence got that bad and there were a couple of bomb blasts, she was fearing for her son's lives. And India was an obvious choice for her because she had a medical visa and she could escape. And her mother was already there. And they came to India in March 2021 in the middle of a pandemic. And we all know how bad the second wave was in India. So at that time, the UNHCR said the COVID situation is really bad in India. We'll do a virtual interview for you. So they gave her a date for September 2022. And when I met her to shoot the film, I reached Delhi around the end of September, beginning of October 2022. And she primarily wanted to speak to me because she was so miffed with the UNHCR for not conducting her interview. And she told me that just a couple of days ago, I was supposed to have my interview. We waited over a year and they didn't do the interview. When we went to the office, they said, why are you here? You can't be here. So that was a big frustration. That is actually the core of how the story started. And that's how we started documenting her. And we actually ended up documenting her till mid of 2023.
Thank you. I want to jump in and ask a couple follow-up questions. When you say she wants to have the interview with the UNHCR, tell our audience what you mean by that and talk a little bit about the card that she is able to get and then what the interview is meant to be a path to.
Sure. So, from what I understood from the Afghan community, is that the UN interview is sort of like, so when you land in India, you get a blue card. Basically, it means you're an asylum seeker. It doesn't mean you can get access to resources in India. It doesn't mean the UN even officially recognizes you as a refugee, an asylum seeker. It also means that if the UN gets, requests from some country like Canada or Australia says, okay, we can take in these many number of refugees from, say, India, they are not eligible for that. So a lot of Afghans that I met were desperate to get the white card from the UN because that meant they would be eligible for resettlement in another country. So when I met Samira, she was in that particular state. It's like you have to pitch your case and say, I am a better refugee than this person. It's just like pitting one refugee against the other. And then when the interview happens, the UNHCR has a lot of backlog cases and they take their own time to, get back to the people and give them the white card. Samira did eventually get the card in 2023 when we did the second round of shoot with her. So yeah, that's pretty much unfortunately what happens in the UNHCR interview. That's from what I've understood from my conversations with the Afghan refugees.
And what I think your film depicts is just the frustration that Samira has, other members of the community, right? They're lined up, there are bureaucratic delays. You depict protests outside the UNHCR because they're putting their hopes into the UN. But as we learned from Ashish earlier, sadly, there are all these delays, and then the Indian government doesn't recognize that kind of documentation as the kind of documentation that would actually allow you to regularize in India. So there's no clear path in India itself. And then there's only this kind of very remote possibility of resettlement. I wanted to also talk a little bit about your personal connection to Samira's story. You've written movingly about how your grandmother's experience of being a refugee after partition inspired you to tell Samira's story of loss and displacement. Can you talk a little bit about this personal connection, how it drew you to telling Samira's story?
Yeah, it's very emotional for me because when you grow up as a child of people who have been displaced, you sort of do not acknowledge that displacement. I mean, I did not for a long time because it was sort of like we were always on the run. Like we have to make our lives, we have to move on from what happened to our family. And there was this form of erasure of, as Ashish said, after partition, there's this erasure of like the memory of the displacement. It's like we cannot sit around moping the fact that we lost everything and we were refugees. And the term refugee itself is not something my parents like to associate with. My grandparents didn't like to associate with it as well. So it was very complicated for me growing up with this identity. Always having this identity crisis where like I go back home to my grandparents' house and my grandparents reminisced a lot about the land and all the beauty of East Pakistan, which is present day Bangladesh. And I always wondered why they were in so much pain for what they had lost. And as a child, you don't get it, right? So there was not a lot of awareness apart from like the casual mention of, oh, we came to this country with nothing, with just clothes on our back and mobs running behind us. So when the CA protests happened in December 2019, I decided to go and attend one of the protests, despite all my friends telling me otherwise. They said, don't go there, it's too risky. And I just felt this urge to go. And when I went there, it just felt like all the intergenerational trauma and wounds had opened up. It's like, why do I feel so wrong by what the government is doing? Because if my grandparents were alive, they don't have any documentation to prove that they're Indian. And the only reason they'll probably not get kicked out of their current homes is because they're Hindu. And that understanding and that, coming to the realization that I had that privilege of being from a majority religion just made me so angry, Parveen, because I was like, what about my grandparents' Muslim friends who, came here to India in 1947, also came to India in 1971 because, the Bengal side has experienced two rounds of violence, which is the 47 partition and the 1971 Bangladesh war. Will they be asked to leave? Will somebody who came with my grandfather or who was a resident of India, and my grandfather wasn't, right? Like he came here. What if somebody who's a Bengali Muslim who's in India, their entire all generations have lived in India, is asked to leave? So all these thoughts just came to my head and I said, I really want to work more on the topic of refugees and migrants. But getting access to these communities is incredibly hard because we've had a lot of issues, political issues with, Bangladeshi immigration and Rohingya immigration. So it's just very hard to, track these communities and figure out where they live. So the Afghan community was much more easier for me to track and figure out because I studied in Delhi. I did my undergrad at Lady Shriram College in Delhi. And that was in Lajpat Nagar, very close to one of the biggest Afghan communities in India. And I used to go there and, meet a lot of Afghans. They were not that worried about their status. Honestly, a lot of them loved India. They had integrated in the country. So it was just one of the easier communities for me to look at when I was looking at selecting a community to work on. Because the Rohingya community is just incredibly difficult to track and also very incredibly difficult to work with because they're so scared of their status. So that was one of the reasons I worked with the Afghan community, and also obviously the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban in 2021. So yeah, that's pretty much my personal connection. And when I started working with Samira, I saw so many parallels of her with my grandmother that it led me to write that article for The Wire India about how, they're 50 years apart in their displacement, but there's so much in common with how they feel about this displacement and being in this vacuum where you're alone and you're completely sidelined from your community, your food, your country. Like you don't know what to do with where your life is going. And it sort of made me realize my grandmother felt the same way about India. She didn't know where her life was going. Her life was over. her generation never got an opportunity. And that the same thing is happening with Samira's family, unfortunately.
It's interesting. I wanted to pick up on a couple of threads. You mentioned that you were able to, obtain access to this community. You found it approachable. I think you're probably being too modest, because I really think that you do bring sensitivity and empathy to depicting this community. So, for example, I was struck by the fact that Samira was very candid on camera, as was her husband and the two sons. And I also was intrigued by the sense of community that the women forged in this handicraft center. And I know you initially started doing interviews in that women's center, but can you talk a little bit just about how you won over this family?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short, but basically it was not easy for sure, because when I landed in Delhi on 28th September 2022, I was working with another subject, and we had spent 9 months working very hard on that story with that subject. And my cinematographer had gone to meet her multiple times. He had met the leaders of the Afghan community, and they sort of take the decisions for whether journalists and filmmakers can interact with the people. So we had built a good relationship with the leaders as well, and everything was on track. But when I got to Delhi, the protest was going on. I went to the protest, and the entire environment there had changed. Nobody wanted to talk to somebody holding a camera. They were more suspicious of why I wanted to interview them, because they sort of felt that after this particular protest in 2022, a deal would come out with the UNHCR, and a lot more people could get resettled in other countries. So that was a big challenge for us. So at that time, a lot of people just turned around and said, "We don't want to work with you." And we were like, what do? We are, in Delhi with our camera equipment, and we don't have a subject. So that's when we went to this handicraft center. We just, started interviewing people, and we saw the camaraderie of the women. And one of the women, Farida, who made it to the film, she said that, the BBC had done a story on the Afghan community, and that had led to the community center being opened up because somebody donated to the Afghan community. And she was very friendly with journalists, and she said, "I'm happy to help you in whatever way I can." And I asked her to connect me to a few subjects in the Afghan community. So she introduced me to two women, Wahida and Samira. And we decided to go ahead with Samira because Samira was very open to building a relationship with us. So we actually spent a lot of days just going to her house, having a meal, talking to her, getting to know them better, with no intention of shooting with her, because we really wanted to build that relationship. And within a few days, she was very willing to let us into her life. There were a lot of things we couldn't put in the film because there was so much pushback. For example, we really wanted to interview Samira's doctor. We said we'll do like a sequence where, Samira goes to the doctor gives her a diagnosis and gives her medicine. And the doctor at the last minute just called me and said, "I didn't want to say this in front of Samira, but if you try to get me on camera, I will stop her treatment now." So I let it go. So there have been many of these instances where I've had to take these creative decisions and let go of subjects and let go of sequences. It really hurts because as a filmmaker, there's so much you want to do. But I'm just very grateful Samira trusted me and built that bond with me. In fact, even after the film's shoot ended, every time I've gone back to India in the last 2 years, I have met Samira. I met her in 2024. I met her in Jan 2025 when I showed her the film. So I have kept in touch with them. It's just a relationship I think I'll have with them for life.
I wanted to just note that what you did include was often very, very absorbing and poignant. You captured tenderness between Samir and her husband, the sons working out in the gym. So even though the family is at risk of deportation and they've been displaced and they're very vulnerable economically and her health is deteriorating, there are those moments where it just seems like it's the ordinary, day-to-day life that really humanizes the story of this family and this community. Thank you both so much. It was a fascinating conversation regarding the law, and then also this look in a very intimate way at the toll of these laws on one family living in New Delhi. I hope that the film gets a wide audience. For our listeners, we will make available on the DC Bar's website links to additional information on this topic, including articles published by both Ankita and Ashish, and also a link to the trailer for Far From Home. Thank you both very much, and good luck to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Praveen.